People rarely betray you only once. By the time the affair, the lie, or the humiliation becomes visible, there is often a second betrayal already growing quietly beside it, the management of perception. That is the part many people underestimate. They think the worst thing another human being can do is break trust in private. It often isn't. The worst thing is to break trust, then calmly begin telling the world a story that makes your dignity look like instability, your questions look like cruelty, and your silence look like guilt. That is a deeper arrogance than infidelity alone. It means the person is no longer merely trying to protect a bad choice. They are trying to colonize reality itself. I learned that in the final year of my marriage. For most of my adult life, I believed truth had a kind of patience built into it. I thought if a man stayed measured enough, careful enough, and decent enough not to turn pain into spectacle, then eventually the real shape of things would become visible without him needing to drag it into the room. That was one of my blind spots. Another was more flattering, which usually means more dangerous. I believed that because I was not easily provoked, I would be hard to misrepresent. In reality, quiet men are often very easy to misrepresent, especially in socially literate environments where the first person to narrate the conflict gets mistaken for the first person telling the truth. If you are calm, and someone more theatrical gets ahead of you, their version of you can travel farther than your character does. By the time reality catches up, the damage is already halfway done. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 49 years old, and until a little under 2 years ago, I had been married for 17 years to a man named Nolan. We lived outside Boston, in one of those older suburban neighborhoods where the homes were large enough to suggest history and the people inside them were accomplished enough to believe appearances still had moral value. We had no children. That fact mattered in ways I did not understand at first. It meant there were fewer forced routines, fewer external obligations to mask our drift, and fewer innocent witnesses whose needs would have slowed the rate at which the marriage could be privately redesigned. It also meant that when the story about me began spreading, there were fewer visible family duties by which outsiders might have measured me more carefully. I worked in operational compliance for a specialty manufacturing firm. My days were built around audits, process controls, documentation, timing, corrective action, and all the ungainly practical structures that prevent charming people from calling their mistakes unexpected complexity. I liked that work because it had no romantic language in it. A system either held or it failed. A control either existed or it did not. Sequence mattered. Evidence mattered. Repetition mattered. If something kept going wrong, there was usually a reason that could be found if enough vanity were removed from the investigation. At home, I made the mistake of believing love deserved more interpretive mercy than systems did. Nolan worked in high-end creative branding for boutique hospitality properties. He was the sort of man people often describe as effortless because they mistake social fluency for natural grace. He understood atmosphere, knew how to make people feel selectively chosen in group settings, and carried himself with the kind of polished lightness that makes more serious men look, by contrast, heavier than they really are. When we met, I admired that. I was steadier, quieter, more inclined to listen first and evaluate later. He made the air feel more colorful. I made life feel more secure. That was the arrangement, at least early on. And to be fair to both of us, that arrangement once had real honesty in it. There had been love. There had been loyalty. We had built a house, buried parents, survived the shutdown years, navigated my mother's decline, and endured 2 separate career transitions that strained both time and identity. We took care of each other through illness, disappointment, and the ordinary erosion of glamour that every long partnership faces if it lasts long enough to become real. I say that because I have no interest in telling the story as though I had been blind from the beginning. I was not blind. I was just faithful to an earlier truth longer than the present deserved. If I am going to tell this honestly, I should admit my own failure without trying to polish it into nobility. I was too proud of being the composed one. Not loud pride. The quieter, male kind. The kind that lets you believe your ability to endure gives you a natural advantage over more emotionally volatile people. I handled the mortgage, the insurance, the retirement transfers, the taxes, the contractor schedules, the home repairs, the endless routine of adult life that turns money into stability instead of drama. I took real satisfaction in that, maybe too much. I thought if I kept our life coherent enough, coherence itself would be recognized as value. What I failed to understand was that coherence becomes invisible to people who benefit from it without respecting its source. They stop seeing the labor. Then, if they are vain enough, they begin speaking about the man providing it as though his steadiness were a personality limitation. Nolan used to call me grounding. Later he called me safe. By the end, in subtler language, he started calling me difficult in the way some people use that word when they mean morally inconvenient. Not dramatic enough to be dismissed, not vague enough to be harmless. Just intense, closed off, hard to live with when stressed. Someone who always needed things to make sense. Those descriptions sound almost reasonable when heard in isolation. That is what made them so useful to him. He did not need to invent a cartoon villain. He only needed to take my most serious qualities and narrate them 1 degree darker. The first true fracture in the marriage was not the affair. It was that private reframing. Nolan began treating his emotional life as if it occupied a higher moral plane than mine. If he felt restless, that was deep. If I felt uneasy, I was over-processing. If he needed space, that was psychologically mature. If I asked for clarity, I was making everything heavy. That phrase became one of his favorites. Heavy. It let him turn the weight of adult truth into a personal flaw on my part. It let him act as though asking for fidelity, context, or honesty was evidence not of seriousness but of some kind of emotional density he had evolved beyond. I should have recognized what that meant earlier. I did not, partly because I loved him and partly because people like Nolan are very skilled at making selfishness sound like sensitivity. They do not say, "I want less accountability." They say, "I need more space to be myself." They do not say, "I am drifting into another man's attention." They say, "I'm trying to understand what's missing in me." And if you are a conscientious person, you hesitate before calling those lines what they often are, elegant cover. The other man was named Adrian. He was a restaurateur and investor tied to one of Nolan's boutique clients, the kind of man who could fill a room without seeming to push. Older than Nolan by maybe 8 years, financially polished, casually observant, with the sort of emotional tone that makes insecure people feel he must be deeper than they are because he appears less hurried by life. I met him twice. Both times he was almost offensively controlled. Not rude. Worse than rude. Effortlessly self-contained in a way that makes other people do half the admiring for him. Nolan described him initially as dangerously charming, which should have been a cleaner warning to me than it was. The signs began accumulating the way signs usually do when you still want the marriage to be salvageable enough that your own intelligence argues with your eyes. More events. More late dinners. More emotional distance that still somehow arrived dressed as self-examination. More phone privacy, but never so much that a stranger would call it suspicious. Nolan was too socially smart to become careless in the adolescent sense. He simply created a second emotional weather system and expected our home to keep functioning under both climates. I noticed all of it. That part matters. I was not absent. I was not dull. I was not one of those men who never look up long enough to see their marriage changing. I saw it. What I failed to do was grant my own perception the authority to act before the story around me had been arranged against me. Because while the affair was growing, a second structure was being built. He began telling people I was the problem. Not openly at first. Not with outrageous accusations. That would have been too easy to challenge. He told a softer, more sophisticated story. Ethan has been struggling. Ethan has gotten very rigid lately. Ethan is difficult when he feels anxious. Ethan doesn't handle emotional complexity well. Ethan is under a lot of stress and sometimes turns that outward. Ethan needs control to feel safe. None of those lines individually sounds like slander. That is why they work. They make the target sound plausible as the issue without requiring any dramatic lie. I did not know how far this had traveled until one night at a friend's birthday dinner. A woman named Claire, who had known us both for years, pulled me aside in the hallway outside the private dining room and asked, very gently, whether things were okay at home. I said we'd been going through a hard stretch. She looked relieved, which told me immediately that relief did not belong to the sentence I had spoken. It belonged to her feeling that she was now hearing my instability confirmed. Then she said, "Nolan's been really worried about you." That sentence changed the entire marriage for me. Not because it proved the affair, because it revealed the second betrayal with total clarity. He had not merely been unhappy. He had not merely been unfaithful. He had begun preloading the social world with a version of me that would protect his future decisions. If the marriage collapsed, it would not collapse because he was deceptive and arrogant. It would collapse because I had become too difficult, too rigid, too emotionally hard to live with. That is a different order of corruption. It means the person is no longer just hiding what he has done. He is using your reputation as part of the shelter. I remember driving home from that dinner and realizing, with a kind of cold steadiness I still recognize, that I had been standing inside two different conflicts without naming either of them properly. The first was private betrayal. The second was narrative warfare. And the second one, in some ways, offended me more. Not because gossip hurts more than infidelity. Because it revealed how fully he had stopped seeing me as someone whose dignity still placed limits on his conduct. I should have confronted him that night. I didn't. That is one of the harder things for me to admit. I still wanted clarity first. Still wanted enough structure that when I moved, I would not be moving from hurt alone. That sounds wise. Sometimes it is. Other times it is just grief delayed by professionalism. I told myself I needed more evidence, more sequence, more certainty. The truth is I was also not ready to accept how much of my marriage had already become performance around a betrayal I had not yet formally named. The actual discovery came through a small administrative accident. Nolan used a shared cloud folder with me for tax documents, insurance files, and household records, mostly because I handled nearly all of that. One Saturday afternoon, while pulling a charitable donation statement for our accountant, I found a PDF with a meaningless file name saved into the wrong folder. It was a reservation confirmation for a 2-night stay at a private inn in Vermont, under Nolan's name, with a note about dietary preferences that included a second guest request matching Adrian's food allergy. The weekend in question had supposedly been one of Nolan's brand retreat weekends in Connecticut. I stared at the document for a long time. Not because I didn't understand what it meant. Because after months of half-protected suspicion, the arrival of full clarity often feels less like impact and more like a room in you going silent. The mind stops trying to save innocence. It just begins reorganizing the truth around what it now knows. I did not confront him immediately. That decision mattered more than almost anything else. If I had confronted him as soon as I found the reservation, he would have had access to my first reaction: pain, shock, personal injury. He would have cried, narrowed the timeline, softened the details, reframed the context, and most importantly, used the version of me he had already sold to others, the rigid, stressed, difficult husband, to explain why he had been driven into secrecy. I did not want his explanation. I wanted the architecture. So I paid attention properly. Charges. Messages synced by accident. Event timelines. Hotel overlaps. A second reservation. Then a third. Then a transfer into a private account he had opened without telling me. By the time I met with an attorney, I had not just an affair. I had a pattern, a timeline, and something even more revealing. Proof that he had been preparing emotionally and socially for the marriage to end while making sure, in advance, that the reason would never sound like him. My attorney's name was Paula Keene. Late 60s exact. Dry, almost aggressively unimpressed by self-styled emotional sophistication. I laid out the affair, the document trail, the account movement, and the fact that he had apparently been telling mutual friends I was unstable or increasingly difficult. She listened quietly and then said, "He's not just hiding. He's inoculating." That was the right word. He had been inoculating the social environment against the truth, giving people just enough of a filtered story about my temperament that when the real reason emerged, it would hit softer against his image. Once I understood that, I changed. Not theatrically. Quietly. Deliberately. I stopped explaining. That was the most important decision I made in the entire collapse of my marriage. Until then, every disagreement between us had followed a familiar structure. He would evade, soften, reframe, or accuse. I would clarify, define, explain, try to restore proportion. The explanation itself had become part of the trap. It gave him time, language, and emotional terrain. It let him remain the more fluid one while I became the man insisting on structure. In other words, it fed the exact public image he had started using against me. So I stopped. I stopped asking where he had been. Stopped explaining why certain things no longer made sense. Stopped defending my need for directness. Stopped offering emotional labor to someone already using my seriousness as evidence against me. I remained courteous, present, responsible. I paid bills, handled the house, showed up at obligations. But I no longer translated reality into softer language for him. That disturbed him more than anger would have. One evening he said, "You've become really cold." I said, "No. I've become done with repetition." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could feel the first real uncertainty entering him. Not guilt. Not yet. Uncertainty. Because the version of me he had been living off depended on my continued willingness to explain myself. The turning point came at a fundraiser. It was one of those museum-adjacent social events where half the room was professionally adjacent to Nolan's world, which meant many of the people there had already been gently prepared to see me as the problem if something happened. Adrian was there too. Calm. Polished. Entirely too comfortable. At one point in the evening, Nolan made a comment within earshot of two couples we knew well. He said, with that carefully pained smile he used when performing emotional burden, "Ethan's been having a hard time lately. He takes things very personally." There it was. Not a direct accusation. Just one more small reinforcement of the public myth. I looked at him and, for the first time, refused the old script completely. I said, very calmly, "That's an interesting thing to say while you're having an affair with Adrian." The room froze. Not because I spoke loudly. Because I didn't. There are moments when a truth enters the air so cleanly that no performance around it can survive first contact. This was one of them. Adrian looked at his glass. One of the women blinked hard and turned slightly away. Nolan went pale in a way I had not seen before. Not because he had been exposed in the romantic sense. Because the second betrayal, the social narrative he had been building, collapsed in the same instant as the first. He whispered, "Can we not do this here?" That line almost fascinated me. Because that was what he had been depending on all along. My refusal to do this anywhere. My politeness. My care for atmosphere. My resistance to turning reality into spectacle. He had mistaken that not just for decency but for usable weakness. I said, "I'm not doing anything. I'm just finished letting you tell the story first." That was the moment the truth came out. Not merely that he had another relationship. The deeper truth was revealed too. He had been preparing the audience in advance because he knew the affair itself would not survive contact with the image he preferred to keep. He thought if he could turn me into the problem early enough, then when the marriage failed, he would still look compassionate and I would look difficult. That is what arrogance does when it becomes strategic. It does not just protect the lie. It tries to preserve social innocence after the lie fails. The aftermath was less dramatic than people might imagine. No shouting. No thrown drinks. No public meltdown. Just the quiet, visible rearrangement of a room that suddenly understood it had been hearing the wrong story. After that, Nolan wanted to talk, of course. Immediately. Privately. That is what people like him always want once the narrative stops belonging to them. He wanted to explain. Contextualize. Tell me he had been scared. Tell me he hadn't known how to speak honestly because I had become impossible to reach. Tell me Adrian had happened gradually. Tell me the public framing had only been because he feared how people would interpret a separation if they thought I was completely fine. That last line told me almost everything. He was not sorry first for what he had done. He was sorry his preemptive story had failed. I listened longer than I needed to, which may have been one final act of old habit. Then I said, "You didn't just lie about the marriage. You lied about my reality in other people's heads." That was the deepest injury, and it remained the deepest one even after the divorce was final. The legal process was ordinary and unpleasant. Accounts, house, retirement splits, social rearrangement. The awkwardness of explaining to mutual friends that no, the problem was not my instability, and also no, I was not going to spend the next year litigating my dignity in every living room. Some people quietly disappeared. Others returned with that embarrassed gentleness people use when they realize they participated, however passively, in the wrong version of someone else. Adrian lasted longer than I expected, but not by much. Once the affair had to live in daylight rather than contrast, it lost much of what had made it feel meaningful to Nolan. That did not surprise me. Relationships built partly on narrative often weaken once reality strips the narrative down to maintenance, money, and ordinary temperament. About a year later, Nolan said something to me outside our accountant's office while we were finishing one of the final tax disentanglements. He said, "I really thought people would believe you were the reason it fell apart." It was the most honest sentence he had spoken in months. I looked at him and said, "I know." There was no need to say more. The truth had already done its work. If there is any message worth keeping from what happened to me, it is this. When someone starts telling the world you are the problem before you have even had a chance to speak, pay less attention to the accusation and more attention to what it is preparing cover for. Not every negative story is manipulation. Some people really are difficult, unstable, harmful, controlling. But when the narrative arrives early, softly, and with too much emotional elegance, it is often not concern. It is positioning. And if you are a calm man, especially a calm man with a strong conscience, you need to understand something early. Your decency can be used against you by people who depend on your reluctance to become public. They count on your silence to preserve their sequence. They trust that you will keep choosing dignity even while they are spending that dignity socially. There comes a point when staying silent is no longer noble. It is simply participation in your own misrepresentation. I reached that point too late, but not too late for the truth. And once the truth entered the room, it did not need me to make it louder. It only needed me to stop apologizing for naming it.